Inside the most horrific destruction of America's black towns, 35 blocks, gone in less than 24 hours. That's what happened to Greenwood, Tulsa in 1921. A neighborhood that existed one day simply didn't the next. Not because of a natural disaster, not because of an accident, because people decided it should disappear. If you go to Greenwood today, you won't see much. There's a highway, some empty lots, a few newer buildings that don't match the old photographs. The streets are quiet. Nothing tells you that this used to be one of the wealthiest black communities in America. Nothing explains where it went. But here's what you need to understand right away. Greenwood was not alone. This happened more than once. It happened in dozens of places across America, and most people have never heard about it. Let me take you back to what Greenwood was before everything burned. In the early 1900s, Greenwood was called Black Wall Street. That wasn't just a nickname. It was accurate. The neighborhood had over 600 businesses. There were grocery stores on every corner, 2 movie theaters, a hospital, law offices, doctor's offices, restaurants where families ate Sunday dinner after church. There were newspapers printed and distributed by black journalists. There were schools where black teachers educated black children in buildings that the community built themselves. People walked to work in the morning, kids played in the streets, families saved money and bought homes. They passed those homes down to their children. Wealth moved from one generation to the next, the way it's supposed to work. The neighborhood was alive in the way neighborhoods are when people have a future they can count on. On a Sunday morning, you would see families dressed in their best clothes walking to church. Men wore suits. Women wore hats. Children walked between their parents holding hands. The churches were full. The singing could be heard from blocks away. After service, people stood outside talking, making plans, checking on each other. This was normal life. This was community. The businesses weren't just stores. They were anchored by people who lived there. A man named J.B. Stratford owned a hotel. It had 54 rooms. It was one of the largest black-owned hotels in the country. A woman named Mabel Little ran a children's clothing store. Dr. A.C. Jackson was a surgeon so skilled that white doctors called him the best in the state. He lived in Greenwood. He worked in Greenwood. He raised his family there. This wasn't a place barely surviving. This was a place thriving. People had money. They had stability. They had hope. And that's exactly why it was destroyed. Now, go to Greenwood today. Stand where J.B. Stratford's hotel used to be. You'll find a parking lot. Walk where Mabel Little's store stood. There's grass and a sidewalk. Drive down Greenwood Avenue. The highway cuts right through where homes used to be. There are plaques now, small markers that try to explain what happened. But plaques don't bring back buildings. They don't bring back the wealth that was stolen. They don't bring back the people who were killed. The gap between what was and what is now, that gap is the story. That empty space is where America hides its violence. And here's what makes this even worse. Greenwood was not the only place this happened to. If you think this was one isolated event, one tragic moment in history, you're wrong. This was a pattern. This was repeated over and over in different states, different years, different methods, but always with the same result. Black communities disappeared. There were towns in Florida, in Arkansas, in North Carolina, in Illinois, places where black families owned land, ran businesses, sent their kids to school, places where people built something out of nothing. And then those places were erased. Sometimes it was fire. Sometimes it was violence. Sometimes it was the government itself deciding that the land was needed for something else. But always, the people who lived there lost everything. You won't find these places on most maps anymore. You won't read about them in most textbooks. The destruction didn't just take the buildings. It took the memory. It took the record. It took the proof that these places ever existed. And the methods didn't stop evolving. After the fires and the massacres, the destruction became quieter. It became legal. It became something you could do with paperwork instead of torches. Communities were drowned under reservoirs. They were cut in half by highways. They were bulldozed in the name of urban renewal. The violence changed its face, but it never stopped. Before we go further into this story, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because this story isn't just about the past. It's about right now. It's about what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. And I want to know that you're here, that you're listening, that you're willing to see what most people never get shown. What happened to Greenwood happened in daylight. It happened with witnesses. It happened with photographs and documents and survivors who told their stories for decades. And still, it was erased. Still, it was hidden. Still, most Americans went their whole lives without knowing it occurred. That's not an accident. That's a choice. And understanding that choice is how we begin to understand what was really destroyed. It wasn't just buildings. It wasn't just money. It was the possibility of a future. It was the proof that black people could build wealth and keep it. And that proof had to be eliminated. So now you know where this story starts. With a neighborhood that existed and then didn't. With 35 blocks turned to ash. With a silence that lasted for generations. And with the knowledge that this was not the only time, not even close. The massacres didn't start with Tulsa. They didn't end there either. What happened in Greenwood was the biggest, the most documented, the one that finally broke through the silence decades later. But it was part of something larger, a cycle that repeated itself across the country for years. The pattern was always the same. A rumor would start. A black man accused of something. An assault, a look, a word spoken to a white woman. The details didn't matter. The accusation was enough. Then the crowd would form. White men, sometimes hundreds of them, gathering in the streets. They would arm themselves. They would march. And they would descend on the black part of town like a storm. What followed was not a riot. Riots are chaotic. This was organized. This was purposeful. Homes were burned. Businesses were looted. People were shot in the streets or dragged from their houses. And when it was over, the black residents who survived were driven out. They left with nothing. No belongings. No money. No way to come back. And here's the part that makes it clear this was not random violence. No one was ever arrested. The men who did the burning, the killing, the destroying, they went home. They went back to work. They lived their lives. The police did nothing. The courts did nothing. In many cases, the police helped. They handed out weapons. They deputized members of the mob. They arrested black people for trying to defend themselves. Take Rosewood, Florida. January 1923. A white woman claimed a black man attacked her. There was no evidence. There was no trial. There didn't need to be. The accusation was enough. A mob formed and went to Rosewood, a small town where black families had lived for decades. They owned homes. They had jobs. They had built a community. Within a week, that community was gone. Homes were burned to the ground. At least 6 black people were killed, though the real number was probably higher. The survivors fled into the swamps and never came back. The town was abandoned. Today, there's nothing left but trees and silence. Or look at Elaine, Arkansas. September 1919, black sharecroppers tried to organize a union. They wanted fair pay for their cotton. That was their crime. White planters couldn't allow it. So they called in a mob. Over the course of several days, white men hunted black people through the countryside. They killed them in fields, in churches, in their homes. Estimates of the dead range from dozens to hundreds. No one knows the real number because no one bothered to count. Afterward, instead of arresting the killers, authorities arrested the black survivors. They charged them with insurrection. Some were sentenced to death. The white men who did the killing walked free. Then there's Wilmington, North Carolina. November 1898. This one was different because it wasn't just a mob, it was a coup. Black people in Wilmington had political power. They voted. They held office. They owned newspapers. White supremacists decided that had to end. They organized. They armed themselves. They published their plans in the newspaper days in advance. On November 10th, they marched into the black part of town. They burned the offices of the black newspaper. They shot people in the streets. They forced the elected government to resign at gunpoint and installed their own leaders. Dozens of black residents were killed. Thousands fled the city. It was the only successful overthrow of a local government in American history. And for a century, it was barely mentioned. These were not isolated incidents. They were not accidents. They were not the result of sudden anger or temporary madness. They were planned. They were public. They were repeated. And they all had the same target: black prosperity. Look at the places where these massacres happened. They weren't targeting the poorest communities. They were targeting the ones that were thriving. Greenwood had wealth. Rosewood had property owners. Wilmington had political power. Elaine had workers organizing for fair wages. That was the threat. Not crime, not violence, success. The idea that black people could build something and keep it. That idea had to be destroyed. And it was. Over and over. In Springfield, Illinois in 1908, in East St. Louis in 1917, in Chicago in 1919, in Ocoee, Florida in 1920, where a black man tried to vote and the entire black community was burned out in response. The methods were the same. The justifications were the same. The results were the same. What makes this even worse is how it was covered up. Newspapers either ignored these events or blamed the victims. They called them race riots, as if both sides were equally responsible. They said black people started the violence. They said the destruction was unfortunate but necessary. They wrote editorials praising the mobs for restoring order. The language was carefully chosen to hide what really happened. A massacre became a disturbance. A planned attack became a spontaneous outbreak. Murder became conflict. Official records disappeared. Death certificates were never filed. Investigations were never opened. When survivors tried to speak, they were ignored or threatened. The message was clear. This didn't happen. And if it did happen, you deserved it. And if you didn't deserve it, no one cares. The silence was not passive. It was enforced. It was policy. And it worked. For generations, these events were erased from history. People grew up in the same towns where massacres occurred and never heard about them. Schools didn't teach it. Museums didn't show it. The country moved on as if nothing had happened. But the people who lost everything didn't move on. They carried the loss. They passed it down. And the gaps it created never closed. The violence didn't stop with fire and bullets. It just changed form. What came next was quieter, more organized, and in many ways, more permanent. The massacres destroyed communities in days. What followed destroyed them over years, piece by piece, until nothing was left but water. This is the story of the drowned towns, the black communities that didn't burn. They sank. It started with progress. That's what they called it. In the early 20th century, America needed power. It needed water for growing cities. It needed flood control for farmland. The solution was dams. Big concrete walls built across rivers, creating massive reservoirs behind them. These projects were presented as modern marvels, as steps toward a better future. But someone had to pay the price. And as always, it was black communities that paid it. Take a town in Georgia, a small place, mostly black families who had lived there since Reconstruction. They owned their land. They farmed it. They had a church, a school, a general store. The houses were simple but solid. The streets were dirt but well-traveled. People knew each other. They buried their dead in the cemetery on the hill. It was home. Then the government announced plans for a dam downstream. The reservoir would flood the valley. The town was in the valley. Officials came with maps and documents. They explained that the land was needed for the public good. Families were told they had to leave. They were offered compensation, but the amounts were insultingly low. The land had been in some families for generations, but the government appraised it as if it were worthless. Appeals were ignored. Legal challenges went nowhere. The decision had already been made. Within 2 years, the town was empty. Homes were abandoned. The church was left to rot. Graves were supposed to be relocated, but many weren't. Families scattered to nearby cities where they had no land, no community, no foundation. Then the dam was finished. The water rose. The town disappeared beneath a lake that now serves recreational boaters and provides power to cities 100 miles away. This wasn't unique. It happened in Kentucky, where a thriving black farming community was flooded to create a reservoir. It happened in Tennessee, where families were pushed out to make way for a dam that powered white neighborhoods. It happened in Missouri, in Alabama, in North Carolina. Small black towns, built by people who had scraped together enough money to buy land after slavery, were swallowed by government projects that benefited everyone except the people who lost their homes. The pattern was consistent. The communities targeted were almost always black. The compensation was almost always inadequate. The relocation assistance was almost always non-existent, and the projects were almost always described as necessary for progress, as if progress required the erasure of black towns specifically. What makes this different from the massacres is the language used to justify it. The mobs in Tulsa and Rosewood were called criminals, even if they were never prosecuted, but the officials who flooded black towns were called planners, engineers, public servants. They had legal authority, they had government backing, they had paperwork. The violence was written into law and carried out with permits and contracts, but the result was the same. Black families lost their homes, they lost their land, they lost their wealth, they lost the places where their parents and grandparents were buried, and they received almost nothing in return. The descendants of these communities still visit the lakes. They stand on the shore and look at the water, knowing that somewhere beneath it are the foundations of their family homes. Some remember the stories their grandparents told. Others only know that something was taken, even if the details are vague. The lakes are popular now. People fish in them. They swim. They vacation on the shores. Most have no idea what's underneath. This form of destruction was quieter than the massacres, but it was just as deliberate. The officials who planned these projects knew where black communities were. They knew that these families had less political power, less money, less ability to fight back. They knew that flooding a black town would face less resistance than flooding a white one. And they made their decisions accordingly. In some cases, the racism was explicit. Meeting notes and government documents show officials discussing the benefits of removing black populations from certain areas. In other cases, it was implicit. The projects just happened to target black neighborhoods over and over, and no one questioned why. The long-term effects were devastating. Families who had spent decades building equity in their land were suddenly landless. They moved to cities where they had to rent. They couldn't pass property to their children. The wealth they had accumulated disappeared. And because this was legal, because it was done by the government, there was no recourse. No one was arrested. No one was charged. There were no investigations, no apologies, no reparations. The drowned towns represent a shift in how black communities were destroyed. The violence moved from mobs to bureaucrats, from torches to blueprints, from public spectacle to quiet policy. But the intent remained the same. Black people had built something. They had claimed space. They had created homes and futures, and that had to be undone. The water is still there. The dams are still standing. The lakes are still used. And beneath them, in the mud and silt, are the remnants of communities that were erased in the name of progress. The families are gone. The homes are gone. Even the memory is fading, but the loss is permanent. The destruction didn't stop with water, it evolved. After World War II, America entered a new era of development. The country needed to modernize. Cities were growing, suburbs were expanding, and to connect it all, the government planned a massive network of highways that would stretch across the entire nation. These roads had to go somewhere. They had to cut through existing neighborhoods. And when officials sat down to draw the routes, they made choices. Those choices were not random. Black neighborhoods were targeted deliberately. In city after city, highway planners looked at maps and decided that the new interstates would run directly through the heart of black communities. The justification was always similar. These areas were called blighted. They were described as slums that needed clearing. Officials used language that made the destruction sound like improvement. like they were doing these communities a favor by tearing them down. But the neighborhoods they destroyed were not slums. They were functioning communities. They had churches that had stood for generations. They had schools where children walked every morning. They had corner stores owned by families who knew their customers by name. They had homes where people had lived for decades, where they had raised children, where they had built equity and stability. These were not abandoned areas. They were full of life, and they were chosen anyway. Take Detroit. The city had a thriving black neighborhood called Black Bottom. It sat near downtown, close to jobs and services. Families owned homes there. Businesses operated there. The community had survived the Great Depression and 2 world wars. Then, in the 1950s, the city announced plans for a new highway. Interstate 75 would cut straight through Black Bottom. Thousands of families were told to leave. Their homes were demolished. The neighborhood was erased. Today, a highway runs where those homes once stood. The same thing happened in Miami. Overtown was one of the most vibrant black neighborhoods in the South. It had hotels, nightclubs, shops, and restaurants. It was called the Harlem of the South. Then Interstate 95 was built. The highway didn't go around Overtown. It went through it. The construction split the neighborhood in half. Entire blocks were destroyed. Families were displaced. Businesses closed. The community never recovered. The highway is still there, a concrete barrier that divided what was once whole. In St. Paul, Minnesota, a neighborhood called Rondo was home to most of the city's black population. It was a close-knit community where people knew each other, where families gathered, where culture thrived. Then Interstate 94 was planned. The route went directly through Rondo. More than 600 homes and 300 businesses were demolished. Families scattered across the city. The neighborhood ceased to exist as a cohesive place. Decades later, the descendants still talk about what was lost. They describe Rondo not as a slum, but as a home that was stolen. Baltimore had a similar story. The construction of Interstate 83 and the Jones Falls Expressway destroyed multiple black neighborhoods. Families were forced out. Churches were torn down. The highways created physical barriers that isolated black residents from the rest of the city. The roads are still there. The damage is still there. The pattern repeated in city after city. Los Angeles, Nashville, Birmingham, Syracuse, Pittsburgh. Wherever highways were built, they seemed to find their way through black neighborhoods. The routes were not accidents. Engineers had options. They could have chosen different paths, but they didn't. They chose the path of least resistance, and in America, that meant going through black communities. These families had less political power. They had less money. They had less ability to fight back, and the planners knew it. The process was always similar. Officials would announce the project. They would hold meetings, but the decisions were already made. Residents would protest. They would organize. They would beg the city to choose a different route, but their voices were ignored. The construction began. Bulldozers arrived. Homes were demolished. Families were given little time to move and even less money to relocate. Compensation was minimal. Many families received far less than their homes were worth. Some received nothing at all. The long-term impact went far beyond the immediate displacement. The highways didn't just destroy homes, they created permanent barriers. A 6-lane interstate is not something you can easily cross. It divides neighborhoods. It cuts off access. Families on one side of the highway were suddenly isolated from families on the other side. Churches were separated from their congregations. Schools were separated from their students. Businesses lost their customers. Property values collapsed. Who wants to live next to a highway? The noise, the pollution, the constant traffic. Homes that had been valuable became worthless. Families who had spent years building equity lost it overnight. And because property is how wealth is passed down in America, the loss didn't stop with one generation. The children and grandchildren of those displaced families never inherited that wealth. The gap widened. The highways also made it easier to leave the cities. White families moved to the suburbs. Businesses followed. Jobs disappeared. The tax base shrank. Services declined. The neighborhoods that remained near the highways deteriorated, not because the people were different, but because the infrastructure had been destroyed and the investment had left. And the language used to justify it all was carefully chosen. Officials didn't say they were destroying black neighborhoods. They said they were clearing slums. They said they were removing blight. They said they were modernizing the city. They used words that made the destruction sound necessary, even benevolent. But the reality was clear. The neighborhoods they called blighted were black. The areas they called slums were black. The communities they said needed clearing were black. This was not urban renewal. It was a targeted destruction. It was a continuation of the same violence that had burned Tulsa and drowned the towns beneath the lakes. The method had changed, but the intent had not. Black people had built something. They had claimed space. They had created communities, and those communities had to be undone. The highways are still there. They still run through the same routes. The concrete is still dividing the same neighborhoods, and the families are still dealing with the consequences. The story of Greenwood begins not with fire, but with possibility. In the early 1900s, a section of Tulsa, Oklahoma became something rare in America, a place where black families could build wealth without asking permission. They called it Greenwood. Others called it Black Wall Street. Both names were true. The neighborhood sat on the north side of the railroad tracks. It covered 35 blocks. Within those blocks, black residents built over 600 businesses. There were grocery stores and restaurants. There were hotels and theaters. There were law offices and medical practices. There were newspapers printed and distributed by black journalists. There were banks where black families could get loans that white banks refused to give them. There were schools where black children learned without being told they were less than human. The people who lived there were not abstractions. They were real. O.W. Gurley owned a boarding house and sold land to other black families. J.B. Stratford ran a hotel with 54 rooms. Dr. A.C. Jackson was a surgeon whose skill was respected even by white doctors who would not treat black patients. John and Lula Williams owned a confectionery and a movie theater. Families saved money. They bought homes. They sent their kids to college. They built something that was supposed to be impossible. Greenwood existed because Tulsa had oil. The oil boom brought jobs and money. Black workers came for the same reasons white workers did. But while white Tulsa grew in one direction, black Tulsa had to grow in another. Segregation forced black residents into a specific area. But instead of letting that limitation destroy them, they turned it into an advantage. Money spent in Greenwood stayed in Greenwood. Black dollars circulated through black hands. Wealth accumulated. By 1921, Greenwood was not just surviving, it was thriving. The neighborhood had its own economy. It had its own culture. It had its own sense of pride. And that pride was visible. The buildings were well kept. The streets were busy. The people dressed well and walked with confidence. This was not supposed to happen. Black people were not supposed to prosper like this. And white Tulsa noticed. On May 30th, 1921, a young black man named Dick Rowland entered an elevator in downtown Tulsa. The elevator operator was a white woman named Sarah Page. What happened in that elevator is still unclear. Some say Rowland stumbled and grabbed her arm to steady himself. Some say he stepped on her foot. Some say nothing happened at all. But the next day, the Tulsa